Two McLarens, two Mercedes, one Red Bull. That's what we saw battling for victory this weekend in Silverstone, and it's down to the simple fact that Sergio Perez's results have started to spiral again. After starting the season well, the last 6 races have been dreadful for the Mexican. From poor qualifying to collisions with the barriers, we've seen the worst of Sergio and seen him tumble down the driver's standings, which has now put Red Bull in a situation where, despite his recent contract extension, they may be forced to find a replacement sooner than we thought. It's definitely becoming a pattern. Once again, Max Verstappen was left all alone to battle it out against the other top teams without help from his teammate Sergio Perez. The weekend was another stark reminder of the struggles Sergio is going through and has been going through since round 7 in Imola. So we need to look at the last 6 races and figure out what's going wrong, because whilst Max Verstappen is once again battling for the lead and finishing in 2nd place, Sergio Perez found himself 2 laps down on his teammate after a failed strategy gamble which the team took because Sergio Perez had to start from the pit lane due to an embarrassing spin into the gravel during qualifying. It's performances like this weekend that are starting to make me feel like 2023 is repeating itself for Perez, where Perez went through a similar, if not quite as bad, 6-race slump between Singapore and Brazil, where he picked up 2 DNFs, like he has in the last 6 races, and was unable to finish in the podium places. But at least last year, he did manage 2 4th-place finishes. But the rest of the grid is in a completely different place to where it was during 2023, meaning his most recent results also have to be treated differently. And even though he recently signed a 2-year extension, keeping him at Red Bull until 2026, in reality, contracts don't mean anything in Formula 1 unless you're quick out on track, and Red Bull haven't held back in the past when swapping drivers, especially when other options are available to them and are starting to look more competitive than Sergio Perez. At this point, Sergio Perez has had a season that has very much been split into 2 halves. We have to go all the way back to round 6 of the season in Miami to find the last time Sergio Perez finished in the top 5, and although we'll get into the difficulties since then, prior to Miami, he was delivering what Red Bull would expect from their second driver. The Mexican had been on the podium 4 times in the first 6 races. He'd never finished outside of the top 5. He was just 33 points behind Verstappen in the championship and positioned 2nd overall in the standings, ahead of Leclerc, Norris, and Sainz, with almost 3 times as many points as the nearest Mercedes driver in George Russell, and 4 times as many points as Lewis Hamilton, who is still behind Fernando Alonso in the standings. But in Formula 1, things move fast, and the story around Sergio Perez's season has changed dramatically. In the 6 races after Miami, from Imola to Silverstone, you would think that a completely different driver was in that second Red Bull car to the one that started the season. Imola saw Sergio Perez drop out of qualifying in Q2, which isn't a huge shock when looking at last year, but an unremarkable opening stint and minimal progress, along with damaging the car on a couple of off-track explorations, left him 8th, and almost a minute behind his teammate in 1st. Then at the Monaco weekend, again it went wrong in qualifying, this time being the 18th fastest driver in Q1 and having to start from the back. Of course, the collision with Kevin Magnussen at the start wasn't his fault, but he shouldn't have been in the position to be wiped out by a Haas in the first place. Canada saw him out in Q1 again, running around just above last place for the majority of the race after a touch with Pierre Gasly this time, before eventually spinning the car into the wall with nobody else to blame. At least in Spain, he was back in the points, qualified in 8th place, which was 6/10 off of his teammate, and then just kind of got stuck there in the race after getting back to 8th place from 11th due to a grid place penalty, which might actually be the highlight performance of these races, an 8th place finish in Spain. Because despite finishing 1 place higher in Austria and actually starting the race from inside the top 10, damage from a first lap tap with Piastri meant his pace was woeful. And even with Verstappen destroying his car with less than 10 laps to go, Sergio Perez still finished 2 places behind him and 20 seconds off his teammate, leading us all the way to this weekend and the worst finish of the bunch. Bringing out the red flag in qualifying was particularly embarrassing. I know we saw Verstappen go off at the same place and bounce through the gravel, but of the 20 cars out on track, Sergio Perez was the only one that put himself out of qualifying in the tough conditions, and is now picking up a bit of a reputation for putting himself out in Silverstone. Not something you expect from a driver so experienced. Then after starting from the pits, I guess you can't blame him for gambling on inters when there isn't much to lose, running around in 15th place on lap 20, but the gamble didn't pay off and he finished 2 laps behind the leaders. Overall, it's been 6 races of underperforming in qualifying, having only started in the top 10 once in the last 6 races, colliding with other cars at the start of the race or damaging the car himself by putting it into walls or beaching it in gravel traps. And I think the problem is that a bad weekend for Verstappen often ends with him finishing second or fifth. But a bad weekend for Perez often sees him fighting with the midfield cars rather than the teams at the top. And having been within touching distance of Verstappen after Miami in the standings, he's only scored 15 points since then, which leaves him 6th in the standings overall with less than half the total points of Verstappen this season, and it's looking likely that it'll be 8th in the standings before the summer break, with the two Mercedes drivers now within 8 points of Perez. You could argue, of course, that despite this drop in form, Red Bull are still leading the Drivers' Championship with Verstappen and still leading the Constructors' Championship too, so what's the problem? But looking beyond that, the only reason that they're still leading the Constructors is due to Ferrari stuttering as the season has progressed, with McLaren and Mercedes emerging since Imola. Red Bull and Perez have kind of lucked out in that there hasn't been a standout second best team on the grid so far this season. Instead, Ferrari, McLaren and Mercedes have all taken points off of each other as we've progressed. However, those teams are now starting to take points not only away from each other, but away from Max Verstappen too. And in recent race weekends, McLaren and Mercedes have outscored Red Bull fairly comfortably and are closing in on the top two in the Constructors' Championship. Given that there's a long way to go this season with 12 races remaining, it's not impossible that we could see a four-way battle for first in the Constructors' Championship. And Christian Horner is aware of the competition that is facing his Red Bull team, saying there's 2 McLarens, 2 Ferraris, 2 Mercedes, we desperately need there to be 2 Red Bulls. With Red Bull confirming Sergio Perez's position within the team before the Canadian Grand Prix, as well as the RB team activating Yuki Tsunoda's clause, which allows them to extend his contract too, it seemed like the only decision left to make was whether Daniel Ricciardo or Liam Lawson would take the second RB seat next year. And I think we all thought it was a bit premature of Red Bull to extend Sergio Perez that early in the season, and 4 races later, it looks like an insane decision. However, there might be a little bit more to this contract than we as the general public get to see, with a few things in there that I think might have Sergio Perez worried. First and foremost, Liam Lawson took part in a 2024 Red Bull test at Silverstone this week, which definitely is giving me flashbacks to last year where Daniel Ricciardo was placed in a Red Bull car at Silverstone and consequently replaced Nick de Vries before the summer break. With Liam going into this year's car, it allows Red Bull to directly compare the performance of Perez this weekend in Silverstone to Liam Lawson on the exact same track. If Lawson goes out there and shows that he has pace in a top car at the same time that Sergio Perez is struggling for any kind of consistency, it will not only serve as a wake-up call for the Mexican that he needs to improve now, but also remind Red Bull that they have a very strong driver waiting in the wings if they can't see Perez improving to the standard required. Then going back to the new contract for Perez that was announced as a 2-year extension before the Canadian Grand Prix, it's been rumoured that the reason that was put in place was to insert some performance clauses into Sergio's contract, with these clauses meaning that Perez could be replaced by the Red Bull team as early as the summer break. The most threatening rumour being that if he's more than 100 points behind Verstappen after the last Grand Prix before the summer break in Belgium, his contract can be terminated. Of course, nobody outside Red Bull has seen the contract, so there's no guarantee that this is true, but the rumours haven't come from nowhere. And on the flip side, nobody from Red Bull has taken the opportunity to deny any of these rumours either. So like many of us were predicting at the start of the year, we could see a driver swap at Red Bull, but it could come sooner than the end of the season. And they could use one of those clauses as an opportunity to get rid of Sergio Perez, whilst also fixing their other driver issue that they have at RB. With 1 seat and both Daniel Ricciardo and Liam Lawson wanting that spot, we've yet to see how Red Bull will find a solution to having 3 drivers for their sister team. And they don't have too long left to make that decision, because in September, Lawson's contract with RB allows him to become a free agent. With teams like Williams, Alpine and Haas still looking for a driver, they could just sign Lawson for 2025. I remember towards the beginning of the year, Helmut Marko discussed how he wanted the sister team to function as a junior team again, with the idea of producing drivers for the main team. If they lost one of their best young talents and held on to an aging Daniel Ricciardo, they wouldn't exactly be moving in the intended direction. So if they want to keep Lawson around, maybe he goes straight into a Red Bull seat alongside Verstappen, not something other young Red Bull drivers have been able to live with, but maybe. Or Daniel Ricciardo finally gets his shot at Red Bull. It looked like his chances had kind of died out at the start of the season with the Australian struggling to keep pace with Tsunoda, And I suppose really we should be talking about Tsunoda as the first choice to replace Perez, but for some reason that never seems to be an option with Red Bull. However, Ricciardo has at least closed the gap in performance to his Japanese teammate and outperformed him in 3 of the last 4 races. So a punt on Ricciardo for the second half of the season to replace Perez isn't the craziest thing imaginable when you consider Ricciardo's experience and the clear love between Red Bull and the Australian. Sergio Perez doesn't seem to think that there's anything to worry about, but I'm sure that the team and other drivers in contention for that seat see things very differently. Sergio Perez finds himself again at the centre of negative attention on the Formula One grid, and once more the entire Formula One world seems to be questioning if he has what it takes to be at a top team. With McLaren, Ferrari, and Mercedes closing the gap to Red Bull this year and leading into 2025, which could be utter chaos, Sergio Perez still has a lot of questions to answer. Although so did Max Verstappen after the Austrian Grand Prix, which is why I made this video here on how the 2024 season led to the inevitable coming together of Verstappen and Norris, and how it won't be the last time either. So if you want to know more about that, click that link and I'll see you over there.